going to have an interesting discussion this evening. Last spring, the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center, in conjunction with the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay, presented a conference on sea level rise and the communities of Jamaica Bay. And during that, we were also looked at storm surge and the various ways in which the communities along Jamaica Bay are endangered, threatened, affected by the conditions that have been produced by climate change. And tonight we're going to have a discussion where we talk about some of the environmental effects of those conditions, as well as we're pleased to have with us two members of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers who are going to be mentioning some of their environmental work that was done in conjunction with various proposals that have been put forth or yes, I guess, and that are being discussed in the wider community these days. This evening, we are also, the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center is also pleased to once again partner with the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay, as well as the New York Seagate. And so we have organizations, and there are at least 100 people already in the audience, and we look forward to giving you a good presentation this evening. May I suggest that you use the chat if you want to say hello, say who you are, where you're from, just see some of the, so the audience can see who some of the people are who are attending this evening. Also, when there are questions, if you have questions throughout, please use the Q&A for your questions. That is how we will be handling questions. With more than 100 people attending, obviously, we're not going to get to all questions, but we will try to include as many. The way it will work was our panelists will make presentations, and then we should have about a half hour at the end, and we will put the we will put the questions to the panelists and those who have been speaking. And now it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague in these efforts, Brett Branco, from the director of the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay. And he will say a few words, and then we'll begin with our panels. So thank you, Brett.
Yeah, and thank you, Richard, and thanks to Jasmine and Jim for all the organization around tonight's event. So yeah, good evening and welcome everyone. I am Brett Branco. I'm the Executive Director of the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay, or SRIJB. We're located at CUNY Brooklyn College. And the mission of the Institute is to produce and disseminate knowledge that can be used to increase biodiversity, well-being, and adaptive capacity in coastal communities and waters surrounding Jamaica Bay and New York City. And we accomplish this through integrated and interdisciplinary programs of research, education, training, public engagement, and science extension and communication. And that last part, the science extension and communication, couldn't happen without New York Sea Grant, who's a critical partner in the Institute. And so I want to acknowledge Katie Graziano, the New York Sea Grant Coastal Resilience Extension Specialist, who's based at SRIJB, who helped to organize tonight's event and assembled our panel of experts for this conversation. This event tonight, to be clear, is not a public hearing on the harbor and tributary study alternatives. Rather, it is a conversation about how those alternatives fit into the larger context of issues in Jamaica Bay. Issues like flooding, water quality, recreation, biodiversity, wildlife habitat, economic opportunity, culture, sense of place, and environmental justice, just to name a few issues. So when new infrastructure projects are proposed, such as what's being proposed by the Army Corps, or at least considered by the Army Corps, we must not consider these projects in isolation. Rather, we must integrate them into existing dialogues about the current state of the Bay and the sustainable and just future that we envision for the Bay and the communities around it. So after tonight, and after the current public comment period on the HAT study draft report closes on January 6, 2023, the SRIJB and New York Sea Grant, in partnership with our extended network, will continue to research, learn, educate, and engage on this process. So tonight is really the beginning of a conversation that does not end on January 6th, but will continue in the context of all the other things that we think are important about Jamaica Bay. So I'm going to post my email address in the chat, and we'll ask Katie to do the same. And please don't hesitate to contact Katie or I after tonight if you want to stay engaged in this dialogue. And I just want to thank you all again for coming out. It's a great turnout tonight. And I'm going to turn it back over to Richard to get us going. So thank you, Richard.
Okay, thank you, Brett, and thanks again for partnering with BWRC in this effort. And so this evening, we will have our panel moderated by Nathan Kensinger, who is a colleague of ours. He has been the 2021-2022 research fellow at the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center. He was also instrumental in our conference last spring, also covering Jamaica Bay and these environmental issues. He also wrote a report. He wrote a white paper for us. It's available both at our website, and I believe you will find a reference to that in the chat either now or later when Nathan starts speaking. But you do want to look at that 40-page paper. It is a great overview of some of the issues facing the communities of Jamaica Bay as well as the body of water. So I guess if the spring conference was on the communities, this is going to be on the water as the water, an environmental environmental place. So Nathan is, in addition to our fellow, he's also a journalist, a photographer, a filmmaker, and he is a man of many skills and talents. And he has also been following the Brooklyn waterfront through his photography over the years. And he has made interesting documentaries recording various happenings in and along the Brooklyn waterfront. And so it is my pleasure to announce the person who will be this evening's moderator, and that's Nathan Kensinger.
Hi there. Can you hear me, Richard?
Yes.
Excellent. Thanks so much for having me this evening. I'm Nathan Kensinger. I'll be moderating this evening. And as Richard mentioned, I'm the 2021 to 2022 Research Fellow at the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center. I'm also a journalist and a photographer and a filmmaker. And I've been documenting the waterfront of New York City really since about 2003 when I first moved to New York. I currently write articles and photo essays for WNYC Gothamist. And over the last decade, I've been documenting all of the recovery and rebuilding efforts that have occurred since Hurricane Sandy in New York City. I've also chronicled the city's first managed retreat away from sea level rise in a documentary film and in numerous photo essays, and have visited all the new coastal barriers that are being built along the waterfront to protect against sea level rise. The study that we're going to be discussing tonight and looking at, the Army Corps of Engineers New York and New Jersey harbor and tributaries focus areas Area Feasibility Study, which is otherwise known as HATS, is one that I've been closely following for several years and written several articles about. And in September, the Army Corps published a report with the details of their tentatively selected plan for this study, the HAT study. The tentatively selected plan is known as Alternative 3B. And really, to put it simply, the proposal is immense. It would impact more than 41 miles of the city's coastline. It would cost $52 billion or more, and take at least 14 years to complete if approved. So tonight we're going to dig into how this proposed plan might impact Jamaica Bay. We're going to talk about the ecology of Jamaica Bay, talk about the salt marshes and some of the endangered ecosystems of Jamaica Bay. And the reason we're looking at Jamaica Bay with this is because the plan proposes multiple storm surge gates and its largest coastal barrier system in the Jamaica Bay region. So it's wonderful to see so many people here tonight to look at this discussion and consider what might come for Jamaica Bay. Your participation and your feedback are really vital for this whole process as we think about what the future of New York City's waterfront might be. I'm going to give a short overview, sort of providing background for what we're going to be discussing this evening, and that'll be followed by presentations by each of the panelists, including a presentation by the Army Corps of Engineers. And following that, we'll have a discussion amongst all the panelists and also get to questions from the audience. But I'm going to share my screen now and give a brief kind of overview about some of the issues that we're going to be discussing this evening. Hopefully you can see my screen now. So tonight's event, of course, is Surge Barriers and the Ecology of Jamaica Bay. And as was mentioned earlier, my fellowship at the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center was focused on writing this paper here, which was published in May 2022. The paper is Sea Level Rise in Brooklyn's Jamaica Bay Communities, Storm Surge Barriers and Managed Retreat. And it looks at how sea level rise will impact Jamaica Bay and at the various projects that are now underway to protect the bay from storms and flooding and climate change. It's a 42-page paper, and we presented it at the BWRC's annual conference, which was about the same topic. And I encourage you all to check it out. It gives kind of an overview of the challenges that Jamaica Bay is facing as sea levels continue to rise. It was published before the Army Corps released their tentatively selected plan, but it does include details on how the plan could impact the bay. For those who are not familiar with Jamaica Bay, the bay is located at the western end of Long Island, and it's an estuary that is protected from the Atlantic Ocean by the Rockaway Peninsula. It's about 39 square miles in size, or about 25,000 acres. And about 16,000 acres are open water and 3,000 acres are marshlands and islands. It's a really important habitat for dozens of species of birds and fish, and the largest system of green spaces on the bay is managed by the National Park Service as part of the Jamaica Bay unit of the Gateway National Recreation Area. We have a representative from the National Park Service here tonight to talk about the impacts that could happen in the national parks areas. And that includes the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge, which spans around 12,000 acres and includes salt marshes and ponds and fields, woods and islands. So there's a lot of different ecosystems around the bay that are really vital to the health of New York City. The bay is also bordered by JFK Airport and dozens of New York City neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Queens, as well as several towns in Nassau County. And almost 3 million people live in the entire Jamaica Bay region. Many of the neighborhoods are on the waterfront and really at the front lines of climate change and sea level rise. And in Brooklyn, there's more than 400,000 people living on communities that border the bay, including places like Mill Basin and Bergen Beach and Canarsie, Starrett City and East New York. This is a map that shows what could happen with the high level of the highest predicted level of storm surge, 9.5 feet. Jamaica Bay has a really long history of storms and floods, but in the coming decade, it could see things much worse than it's experienced in the past, and will be really dramatically impacted by sea level rise. According to the most recent report from the New York City Panel on Climate Change, by 2100, New York could see anywhere from 15 inches of sea level rise to 9.5 feet of sea level rise. And that amount depends really on how much emissions are cut around the world. But 15 inches would present serious catastrophic results in some parts of the bay. 9.5 feet really would just result in permanent flooding of many of the neighborhoods around the bay, as you can see in this map. Much of the Rockaway Peninsula, Broad Channel Island, Howard Beach, Bergen Beach, and Mill Basin would be underwater at normal high tides, along with large parts of Canarsie. And the ocean will have encroached really deeply into East New York, and really just drowned many of the salt marsh islands around the bay. But these are not issues that are going to just occur 80 years from now. The problems caused by sea level rise are already visible around Jamaica Bay. There's coastal erosion, salt marsh degradation, and tidal flooding, which are common problems today in neighborhoods like Hamilton Beach and Broad Channel Island. The streets are flooded during monthly high tides. This has been a problem for decades, but it's only getting worse as sea levels rise. And it's expected, as sea levels do continue to rise, that this tidal flooding, which occurs monthly with the high tides, could become a daily occurrence that could occur as early as the 2050s. As Hurricane Sandy showed, this is the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy in this photograph. The area around Jamaica Bay and the Rockaways was not prepared for a major storm surge. During Sandy, the storm surge completely inundated the Rockaway Peninsula and Broad Channel Island and flooded neighborhoods along the north side of the bay, damaging thousands of buildings and leaving behind hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. And the expectation is that we're going to see more frequent and more intense storms in the future due to climate change and sea level rise. To address some of this in the short term, there's been a whole series of projects around the bay and around the Rockaways. This is looking at an Army Corps project that's currently building $340 million worth of jetties and reinforced dunes on the ocean side of the Rockaways to protect against storm surges. And in 2017, the city completed a $341 million reconstruction of the Rockaway Boardwalk and turned it into a reinforced concrete barrier that's explicitly designed to resist the impacts of climate change and sea level rise and storm surges. There's been smaller projects in neighborhoods around the bay to protect homes and neighborhoods and streets. This is a photograph looking at a $67 million project happening right now in Broad Channel Island to raise the streets up higher so that they won't have that tidal flooding problem as frequently, or for at least until sea level begins to encroach on the streets again. And it also is installing new storm sewers throughout that community. And there's been several different wetland restoration projects around the bay or that are planned for the near future. The Army Corps is actually working on several restoration plans for salt marsh islands in the bay and about 80 acres of wetland habitat on Fresh Creek, which is on the north side of the bay. There's also been several smaller restorations in different areas controlled by the New York City Parks Department, like this scene here. This is a smaller couple-acre restoration on Fresh Creek in Canarsie. And there's also been areas of the bay where neighborhoods are simply retreating from sea level rise. There's, with the assistance of the city government. In Hamilton Beach and Edgemere, the city has begun buying homes and properties with the idea that they will not be developed upon, that they'll tear down the homes and not develop upon the land, but use it as kind of a green space and buffer for wetlands to fill in and retreat from rising sea levels, with the hope that that'll help absorb some of the impacts of flooding and possibly storm surges. But the biggest plan, of course, which we're going to look at closely tonight with the Army Corps of Engineers, is the New York and New Jersey HATS proposal. The projects that have occurred up to this date are very small in scope compared to what the Army Corps is now proposing. In September, they released the feasibility study for the HATS study. And this alternative that they're considering, Alternative 3B, is a $52 billion proposal that would build 12 storm surge gates across waterways in New York City and also in New Jersey, and would erect coastal barriers across more than 41 miles of the city's coastline. In some of the biggest elements of this HATS proposal are proposed for Jamaica Bay and for the Jamaica Bay region. And they would cause some of the most serious environmental impacts too, according to the Army Corps report. In the Jamaica Bay region, the Army Corps has proposed building a 21-mile-long coastal defense system that would stretch from New Utrecht, Brooklyn to Far Rockaway, Queens. And this system would include storm surge barriers at the mouths of Sheepshead Bay, Garrettson Beach, and Jamaica Bay, and coastal barriers, including flood walls and levees and reinforced dunes and seawalls, and a tide gate across Coney Island Creek. The system of barriers is not being designed or intended to hold back sea level rise inside Jamaica Bay. It's intended to address storm surge and large surges from like future storms that are expected to become more frequent and intense. This is looking at a rendering from the Army Corps of Engineers from 2019. And it is of the surge gate that is proposed or that could be built at the mouth of Jamaica Bay. It would cross the bay at the entrance of the bay, right near Floyd Bennett Field, which you would see here kind of on my left. It would span approximately 3,800 feet from shore to shore and include 2 navigable passages where boats could go through. Each of those would be 200 feet wide. You see those in the center of the rendering here. And some of the concerns raised by environmental groups about these kinds of barriers, the groups that I've spoken with for articles, their concerns are that they could really impact the tidal flow of the water going into the bay and also interrupt the migration of fish and other marine life. Groups are also concerned, this is a second rendering showing a more kind of schematic view of that proposed gate at the mouth. Groups are also concerned about what could happen when these gates are closed during storms, because they could trap rainwater and sewage overflows and other pollutants inside the barrier, causing a backup of toxins and flooding inland. And closing the gates during storm surges could also worsen flooding outside of the barrier on the ocean side, because the storm surge coming in has to travel somewhere. If it's blocked off from entering a waterway or entering the bay, the water has to travel somewhere else. So for the Jamaica Bay barrier, at the one that's proposed for the mouth of the bay, the entire shoreline of the western end of the Rockaways, including all of Breezy Point, would need to be wrapped in a whole system of flood walls and reinforced dunes and levees to help mitigate the flooding that would be caused by the gate being closed. So the gate itself would potentially cause worse flooding in areas at the western end of the Rockaways. Besides the storm surge gate that's proposed for the mouth of the bay, the tentatively selected plan also calls for a separate barrier at the mouth of Hawtree Creek and on Shellbank Basin. This would impact the waterfront neighborhoods of Howard Beach and Hamilton Beach. And the gates that are proposed here is smaller, but would also just allow for a navigable passage that's 60 feet wide at the mouth of those 2 waterways. And another storm surge barrier is also proposed at the head of Jamaica Bay, meaning the far end of Jamaica Bay near JFK Airport. And this is where Hook Creek flows down into the bay. This barrier would be approximately 900 feet from shore to shore and also have a navigable passage that's about 60 feet wide. And this gate would impact several really unique Queens waterfront neighborhoods, including Meadowmere and Rosedale. And it would impact the entire ecology of Eastern Queens, including the extensive wetlands that still exist in Idlewild Park. So tonight we're going to be looking at how this proposed plan could impact the unique ecology of the bay and the neighborhoods around the bay. And we're going to hear from the Jamaica Bay Guardian, Don Reapy, We're going to hear from representatives of the Army Corps and the National Park Service and professors from Sarah Lawrence College and the City University of New York. And while our focus might be looking at this Army Corps proposed plan on the Bay, what we're really going to be considering is, what is the future of Jamaica Bay? And what is the future for all of New York City's waterfront as we grapple with the reality of sea level rise and storms and flooding and the potential catastrophic devastation that could occur in the future? So after everyone has had a chance to do their brief presentation, we'll have a discussion amongst all the panelists and take questions from the audience. So I'm going to end my presentation now and introduce our panel for the evening, and we'll get started on those presentations. So the panelists this evening each have long and very excellent bios. I'll try to synopsize as I can, but we're first going to hear from Kyle McKay and Carissa Scarpa from the Army Corps of Engineers. Kyle is a research civil engineer with the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center. His research focuses broadly on examining ecological effects of water resource infrastructure with applications related to urban ecosystem restoration, ecological models, dam operations, and decommissioning and flood risk management. Dr. McKay is also a licensed civil engineer in the state of Georgia and an adjunct faculty member at the University of Georgia. We're going to hear from Patty Rafferty, who has been the Chief of Resource Stewardship at the National Park Service Gateway National Recreation Area for 6 years. Rafferty formerly worked as a coastal ecologist for the National Park Service until 2016. And before joining the National Park Service, she worked as an ecologist for the National Wetlands Research Center. Rafferty is currently working out of, I'm going to mispronounce this, Patchogue, New York. We're also here from Don Reapy, who is employed as the Jamaica Bay Guardian for the American Littoral Society. In 2003, he retired from the National Park Service, where he worked as the naturalist ranger and manager of the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge. And he's written many articles on natural history subjects, and his photographs have been widely published in many journals, including Scientific American, National Wildlife, Audubon, Underwater Naturalist, Parade, and the New York Times. Don has a MS in Natural Resources Management from the University of New Hampshire. We're also going to hear from Bernice Rosenzweig, a professor at the Environmental Science Department at Sarah Lawrence College. Her research focuses on climate change, extreme weather, and urban water systems, and she's particularly interested in the interactions of global climate change and megacity development. She currently co-leads the flooding working group of the New York City Panel on Climate Change and grew up in East New York near Jamaica Bay and holds degrees in environmental geology and environmental engineering. And we'll be hearing from Chester Zarnock, a professor of environmental studies and biology at Baruch College at City University of New York. Chester is a graduate faculty in the biology program at CUNY's Graduate Center and has been an active researcher in marine ecology and aquaculture since 2001 and has published papers on shellfish biology, sediment nitrogen cycling, salt marsh ecology, and intensive aquaculture. His current research is aimed at describing the biological and physical processes that influence ecosystem services derived from restored habitats in urban estuaries. So we'll get started with our panel now with a presentation from the Army Corps of Engineers discussing some more details of the HAT study.
Thank you and good evening. Thank you, Nathan, for the introductions. I'm Carissa Scarpa. I'm the section chief in the Environmental Analysis Branch at the New York District. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the study itself and the background, and then I'll turn it over to Kyle to talk a little more about the Tier 1 EIS and the analyses that have been conducted to date. Next slide, please, Kyle. So following Superstorm Sandy, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers completed the North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study, which identified 9 high-risk focus areas on the North Atlantic coast for further in-depth analysis into potential coastal storm risk management measures. of those 9 areas identified was, one of those 9 areas identified was the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Tributary Study Area. Next slide, please. So the HAT study area on the left of the slide covers all of New York City, New York Harbor, Newark Bay, numerous tidal straits, and all tributary rivers flowing into New York Harbor to the head of tide, which on the Hudson River extends north to the Troylocken Dam near Albany. It covers the most highly urbanized and densely populated area of the country, including all of New York City and the most populated cities in northern New Jersey. The study is being carried out in partnership with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, New York State Department of State, and the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. Thank you. So a couple things to note. The plan you'll hear about today is preliminary and conceptual. Details are subject to change on based on new information and the feedback that we receive from the review, careful review of the report. This project has not been approved or funded by the U.S. Congress, the states of New Jersey and New York, or local governments. And there is no impending construction or permitting for the project at this time. And the other thing I want to mention is that, you know, we're here to present and kind of get feedback. So we value that feedback. We would point everyone to our draft integrated feasibility report and tier 1 environmental impact statement. And, you know, we're looking for all the help we can get getting the word out about this report and just helping communicate, you know, the opportunity for comment right now over this entire study area. We're definitely looking for written comments. I want to emphasize that, you know, in order to accurately record comments and thoughts and impressions from everyone, we do appreciate written comments. So email and mail is the best way. Although, you know, I'm sure we'll hear tonight from folks, and we do, you know, we are documenting, you know, all the feedback that we're getting. The public comment period currently closes on January 6th. But however, we are seeking and anticipating an extension to that, which will be announced hopefully very soon. But we do have a series of public meetings that we are working to plan. We have held 3 virtual public meetings and had 15 external engagements by invitation since the public comment period started following the release of the draft report at the end of September. The next meeting, there is an in-person public meeting planned at the Alexander Hamilton U.S. Custom House in Lower Manhattan on December 15. And there will be, as I said, additional public meetings scheduled in coming months. So I encourage you all to just keep an eye on our study website and social media where you'll get information on additional in-person public meetings that we'll be planning in the future. So, and another final thing I wanted to just point out about the report itself is that if you haven't dove into it yet, I really encourage you to start with the reader's guide and the story map, which we have available at our website. It's got a lot of help. They both have a lot of helpful information that will get you started navigating through the report more efficiently. Next slide, please. Okay. So just some basic things about the formulation of the study. The alternatives that have been formulated were formulated to address coastal storm risk for the HAT study area, and they spanned a spectrum from large in-water structures that are effectively gates that can be opened and closed to stop water flow, otherwise known as storm surge barriers, as you saw a rendering of, And that's one end of the spectrum. But on the other end, we also looked at, land-based structures. So given the number of bays, tidal straits, and tributaries, and the general geography of the HAT study area, there are just many locations where a relatively short distance storm surge barrier with associated shoreline-based tie-ins to high ground could be implemented to address coastal storm risk for vast distances of shoreline. We have over the past several years evaluated these different combinations of storm surge barriers and shoreline-based measures for this complex and variable study area. Throughout this evaluation, a few key points have become evident. First, depending on how you view the various alternatives, each has its own pros and cons. While we need to select and focus on one to move the study forward, we do continue to seek input. So if you support one over another, we want to hear from you. We're collecting all those comments and thoughts and impressions. The second point is, in the course of the study so far, it's become apparent that the middle alternatives, that is alternatives 3A, 3B, and 4, are economically the best performing alternatives, but there are noticeable differences between them. Alternative 3B does perform the best and is the tentatively selected plan. And, again, we're just looking for continued input on that selection. So we chose a plan, when we were looking at plans, we chose a plan that was layered because managing coastal storm risk is essentially a shared responsibility, and not only between federal, state, and local government, but also the public. So the plan needed to be phased in implementation, and it needed to have a number of different kinds of complex features in order to, provide the protection needed, and then also be adaptable as well in the long term to better respond to future unknowns such as sea level rise. Okay, I think we can switch to the next slide, Kyle. Thanks. Okay, I'm sorry, I got my slides a little bit out of order. Give me 1 second. Okay, so this is a slide that summarizes the plan formulation iterations. In the first round, the PDT focused on identifying the best spatial scale of the alternative, as documented in the interim report, which is available on our website as well, which was released in 2019. The best scale of CSRM solutions was regional, which was represented by alternatives 3A, 3B, and 4. In the next round, the PDT focused its efforts on differentiating among those front runners, 3A, 3B, and 4. Major decision factors included relative sea level change scenarios, operational assumptions for the storm surge gates, environmental and navigational considerations, and refinement of benefits. The results of that round got us to the selection of 3B. In the third round of formulation, the TSP, or alternative 3B, will be evaluated at different size measures to maximize net benefits and alignments. And those alignments may be adjusted based on social, environmental, or economic factors. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so here we have the TSP, the tentatively selected plan, alternative 3B. Alternative 3B includes storm surge gates at Jamaica Bay and southern Brooklyn, Kilvin Cole and Arthur Kill, as well as Gowanus, Newtown Creek, and Flushing Creek with tie-in shoreline-based measures. Also shoreline-based measures in Lower Manhattan, East Harlem, and Jersey City, and numerous other complementary features, including what we call residual risk features, which Nathan described a little bit. We also will be including non-structural measures like elevations and floodproofing, and also natural and nature-based features, but those are still under development. Next slide, please. Okay. So the features around Jamaica Bay include the storm surge barrier, which you saw a rendering of at the entrance to the bay, which consists of two 200-foot wide sector gates for navigation and 15 auxiliary lift gates. And then we have the barrier flanked by tie-in levees and flood walls that would serve to protect against induced flooding. And then we also have behind the barrier a series of those residual risk features that protect against lesser events. And I think it's good to mention that the total length of the Jamaica Bay barrier is 3,800 feet. All right, next slide, please. And here's just some details on some of the barriers in and around Jamaica Bay. And I think it sort of speaks for itself. And there's that rendering again. Next slide, please. And again here, you're seeing the effect of looking at the intermediate sea level rise scenario by 2095. Which Nathan had also shown, along with on the right-hand side, a look at how we think alternative B will provide protection or storm risk in those areas, same areas. Next slide, please, Kyle. Okay. So a little bit about the tiered EIS. Given the complexity and scale of this study and the potential for significant impacts, the study team elected to prepare a tiered environmental impact statement. This means that right now, our tier 1 environmental impact statement is part of this feasibility phase and is included in the feasibility report. And we will include a final tier 1 EIS in the final feasibility report. And so that, tier 1 EIS assesses the potential impacts on a very broad scale. And, the next phase, a tier 2 environmental impact statement is planned, which would be carried out in what we call the pre-construction engineering and design phase of the project, which means that the project has been authorized and now we are moving into a design phase, which is going to allow us to look more closely on a localized scale and be able to talk a little more specifically about the design and the exact dimensions of the project features as we continue to gather more details on the actual, real conditions on the ground. Again, I just have to emphasize that I always have this on my notes for this slide. No plan can be constructed until a full tier 1 and tier 2 environmental impact statement has been completed and all permits have been obtained. So that gives you a little bit of the scope of how we are conducting this analysis. Next slide, please. Oh, and this one, so from here, I think I'll turn it over to Kyle to talk a little more specifically about the EIS. Kyle?
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. And thank you all for making time to join us tonight. So in terms of tonight's focus on environmental effects of storm surge barriers, what are some of the approaches we're using today? So I'm going to talk you through 2 different approaches that are being used to look at these storm surge barriers and other features as part of these plans. So in this tier 1 environmental impact statement, and in the draft report, I should say, the approach to this is to look at different environmental outcomes individually, and then look at them at the aggregate effect of those alternatives in light of all of those actions. And when I say individual resources or individual environmental outcomes, the National Environmental Policy Act requires the Corps to look at dozens of different policies, whether it's effects on habitat loss and change or endangered species, all the way to occupational safety and health. So the environmental impact assessment process looks at each of those. And for this draft report, over 50 environmental resources were assessed. And they were assessed in two sort of rounds or two iterations. First, we looked at each of the types of actions that might be undertaken. So a storm surge barrier versus a flood wall, a tide gate, or a berm, for instance, and looked qualitatively at whether those different actions would affect different outcomes. So how would they affect migratory fish or submerged aquatic vegetation? So just in a binary context of yes, no. And then after some very preliminary screening using those methods, we kind of sharpened the pencil a bit and looked at a semi-quantitative approach for assessing environmental impacts on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is no impact and 5 is a substantial effect that would exceed a regulatory standard. And each of our resources were then scored on this consistent 1 to 5 scale to provide, again, consistent metric of comparing across outcomes. So what does that look like in practice? Well, it looks like lots and lots of spreadsheets of numbers. And those numbers get rolled up into these sort of scorecards. And here, I've shown one example of that, where for each of the environmental resources examined in the report, shown on as the rows in this matrix, each of the alternatives was assessed on this 1 to 5 scale. And a couple of notes about process and then about outcomes. So first, this semi-quantitative scale allowed us to break things into slightly smaller bites so that we could say, not just how does an alternative affect the environment, but how does it affect hydrologic resources specifically? And then for hydrologic resources, how does it affect tides, velocities, shear stress? These are different hydrologic outcomes, for instance. And 3 different scorecards were developed. So one for the construction footprint of the given action, a second for operations and maintenance, and a third for how those actions could be mitigated. And here I've just shown one example of that, the mitigated effects score. And important for the purpose of tonight's conversation, we feel like this method allows people to come in on very specific aspects of the report. So allows you to zoom in and say, how did they think about tides relative to this alternative? So you can go into the depth of detail that your expertise and your interests align with. So what are some key observations about this process? One is that the alternatives vary somewhat significantly in their impact magnitude. Each of the resources can vary, but also across the alternatives, things can vary. Second, impacts are generally highest during construction, but are largely temporary. And then third, the impact producing factors are very dependent on the structures. So are they in the water in terms of a storm surge barrier, or on land, like say a seawall might be? And then finally, some alternatives incur beneficial effects. You can imagine that some alternatives may actually protect cultural resources from flooding. And so that there are alternatives that do in fact have benefits, not just impacts. But briefly, I should point out that one big missing gap here is it says ecosystems. And here, rather than looking at this 1 to 5 scale, we tried to look at it in a slightly more quantitative way. So what we were doing here is developing an ecological model to look at regional ecosystems. And we've done this in partnership with some agency stakeholders that have helped us along the way and pointed us on the right direction. But these models assess 6 different ecosystem types. So 3 marine systems, So the intertidal, subtidal, and deep water systems. And you can think of these as those outside of the barrier islands on the ocean side. And then 3 estuarine systems, intertidal, subtidal, and tidal fresh. So how did we go about doing this? As I mentioned just briefly, we've had a series of workshops with agency scientists in 2019 before the study was paused. And subsequently, what we've been doing is taking that input from the workshop and formalizing it in a numerical model. And we're doing this through a set of methods called reproducible research. So for anyone interested in the nerdy modeling details, you're welcome to pop open these links. One is for the model report and one is for the code itself. So I know that's unpopular, but I am the world's biggest nerd, so I feel the need to share code with all people. So yeah, we're working in these reproducible research platforms to share our quantitative models. Third, we're applying these models at these massive scales. So the HAT scale is enormous, thousands of square miles. And we need data sets that match that. So we need to be able to read in large scale regional or national data sets and make inference based on those. I also want to point out that we're in the process of getting these models certified, which is a formal form of peer review in the core, as well as vetting them in journal audiences. What does this look like in application? Just to give you an idea, on the left, you see tidal zones differentiated based off of hydrodynamic inputs, salinity zones in the middle, and then when you combine those, you can identify these habitat zones. And for each of those habitat zones, we can then look at the quality of that habitat with and without our storm surge barriers. So we've used these models in 2 ways to examine the effects on regional ecosystems. First, you can imagine applying these models and then setting the infrastructure down on it. And those are the direct kind of footprint impacts of the infrastructure. Shown here is the black bars. And secondly, we've used them to look at indirect effects of what happens when you change hydrodynamics as a result of putting in the storm surge gate. And those are the hatched bars, kind of white background bars here. And a couple of observations. The relative proportion of direct and indirect effects changes depending on which of these alternatives you're examining. So with alternative 2, the really big barriers out by the ocean, you see more indirect effects and smaller direct footprint. But with some of the other alternatives, you see the inverse. You see when you have more shore-based measures, you have a larger footprint of effect. Also notable, alternative 2 and 3A tend to show the greatest amount of ecological change, whereas alternatives 3B, 4, and 5 show less, sort of in sequence there. And alternative 3B in particular, our star of the night, shows a lower amount of change on an ecosystem by ecosystem basis than alternative 4, but the net effect isn't the same when aggregating across all of those or adding them all up. So just briefly in terms of what these models show in Jamaica Bay. So they show, unsurprisingly, that the direct effects would have a larger foot impact. I am sorry, I lost a legend somewhere along the way. The dark green is intertidal estuary systems and the light green is subtidal systems. So unsurprisingly, the direct effects of these alternatives, these footprints, would have more effect on estuarine systems, both subtidal and intertidal. And then when aggregated at the scale of Jamaica Bay, there are also quite a few indirect effects in terms of changes of subtidal and intertidal. That when putting in these storm surge barriers, not all effects are negative. It's not always that there is less habitat. So you can imagine putting in a barrier and depths increasing and it actually increasing the amount of subtidal habitat. So just an example of the complexity of how these barriers can play out on the landscape. A couple of notes to get the conversation going. This draft report is focused on conceptual designs, so very different concepts, and deciding what general trajectory the project planning would proceed towards. And now that we know what general path it's on, we're able to sharpen the pencil and look at more and more detailed analyses with a specific focus. At present, we've only applied the models I've shown you in an open gates condition, which would be the condition the vast majority of the time. Whereas for the final report, we'll be looking at some closed gate analyses and some additional analyses that we'll be doing. A couple of areas that seem very fertile for research and for further investigation with smart folks like on this call are things like how the barriers could affect migratory organisms, how, as Nathan alluded to, they could affect water quality during closures, and other things like that. I'll point you to the ecological modeling report. It has an entire chapter on potential expansions that might be of interest to some folks on this call. So with that, we will cede the floor and appreciate your attention and look forward to hearing from the other panelists. So thank you.
Thank you so much. We're now going to hear from Patty Rafferty, and I'll just remind the panelists to keep your presentations under the 10-minute time limit that we had discussed. And I hand it over to Patty now. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit of information about the National Park Service's relationship with this planning process, and also to talk really briefly about some of the park resources that could potentially be impacted by the tentatively selected plan. I won't be presenting the Park Service's comments on the Tier 1 DEIS this evening. Our comments will be forthcoming as part of the Department of Interior's comments on the Tier 1 draft environmental impact statement. So my comments this evening will be limited to Gateway National Recreation Area, which is just one of the National Park Service units that are within the HAT study area. Castle Clinton, Governor's Island, and Statue of Liberty National Monuments are other National Park Service units that are within the project area. In addition, National Park Service also has an interest in the potential impacts of the project on land and water conservation fund lands, as well as on National Historic Landmarks that are not on NPS property, but I won't be addressing those issues this evening. If you look at this map of the Jamaica Bay area of the tentatively selected plan and our Jamaica Bay unit, you can see that many of the components of the tentatively selected plan would occur within the boundaries or on lands of the National Park Service. The Tier 1 draft environmental impact statement identifies that approximately 125 acres of National Park Service property would be required for implementation of the tentatively selected plan. Gateway is currently celebrating our 50th anniversary. 50 years ago, we became the nation's first urban national park. And in establishing Gateway, Congress recognized that within the boundaries of the park, there existed federally designated navigation channels that would require maintenance and improvements, as well as the potential for the development of coastal storm risk management projects on NPS land and/or waters. The park's enabling legislation established the legal requirement that any such Army Corps projects must be mutually acceptable to the Secretary of the Interior and the Secretary of the Army and must be consistent with the purpose of the park's enabling legislation. Gateway's enabling legislation also specifically calls out the responsibility for protection of the islands and waters of Jamaica Bay and for the conservation and management of natural resources, fish, and wildlife located within the bay. The Organic Act of 1916 is the foundational legislation for all national park units. This legislation establishes the mission of the National Park System to preserve and protect the natural and cultural resources within our national parks for the enjoyment of future generations. The United States Army Corps of Engineers is the federal agency responsible for compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act to evaluate the potential environmental impacts of the proposed New York and New Jersey harbor and tributary study. NPS is one of 6 federal agencies that are cooperating agencies. A cooperating agency is any federal agency other than the lead agency that has jurisdiction by law or special expertise with respect to any environmental impact involved in the proposed project. As a cooperating agency, the National Park Service is not a decision maker with regard to the New York and New Jersey HATS project. Our role as a cooperating agency is to provide information and expertise during the project planning process. Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act requires federal agencies to take into account the effect of proposed projects on historic properties and to the maximum extent possible to minimize harm to those historic resources. The National Park Service is a consulting party in the 106 process for the New York, New Jersey HATS project. As a consulting party, NPS provides information and input, but NPS is not a decision maker. The NPS interest as a consulting party is to try to ensure that to the maximum extent possible, the project is developed to avoid and minimize adverse effects to historic resources and to mitigate for any impacts that can't be avoided. In addition, NPS lands within Gateway National Recreation Area are Native American ancestral lands, and the NPS has an interest in the National Historic Preservation consultation process to ensure that the interested federally recognized tribes are fully engaged in the plan development. Over the course of the next couple of slides, I'm going to very broadly identify some of the resources that the National Park Service has identified that could potentially be impacted by the tentatively selected plan. Before doing so, I want to introduce you to the term that we use in the Park Service of fundamental resources and values. For NPS, these are the attributes of a park, those features, systems, processes, experiences, stories, scenes, sounds, smells, and visitor opportunities that are critical to achieving the park's purpose. Gateway National Recreation Area's 2014 General Management Plan fully identifies the park's fundamental resources and values, and those are the park resources that serve to focus on what is most truly important about the park. There are 6 National Historic Districts within Gateway's Jamaica Bay unit that are located within the Jamaica Bay region of the plan study. This includes Fort Tilden, Floyd Bennett Field, Reese Park, Breezy Point Surf Club, Silver Gull Beach Club, and the Far Rockaway Coast Guard Station. The Fort Tilden and Floyd Bennett Field historic districts are fundamental park resources. In addition, the National Park Service also has a responsibility for the protection of archaeological resources within our historic districts or on any lands, emergent or submerged lands within the park. The beach and dune system at Breezy Point Tip, Plum Beach, Fort Tilden, and Jacob Reese Park are fundamental park resources. The beach and dune systems of the Jamaica Bay unit on the Rockaway Peninsula are maintained by natural processes, including longshore sediment transport, cross-island sediment transport, and dune development and evolution. The construction of the buried seawalls, berms, and exposed seawalls throughout existing dunes and shorelines would transform the dynamic ocean and bay beaches and dunes on NPS lands on the Rockaway Peninsula into static engineered features. And although the Jamaica Bay ecosystem exists within a highly modified urban landscape, it is a very important natural resource. Jamaica Bay waters are a fundamental park resource, and the natural areas that surround the bay at Breezy Point Tip, Floyd Bennett Field, and the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge are also fundamental park resources. The Jamaica Bay Estuary is one of the largest open spaces in New York City and is one of the largest coastal wetland ecosystems in New York State. The National Park Service mission identifies the national parks that national parks are intended for public enjoyment. For any projects that are proposed to occur within the National Park Service boundaries or on NPS property, evaluation of the impacts on the visitor experience is always required. Many visitor experiences within Gateway National Recreation Area's Jamaica Bay unit are fundamental resources. The beach experience, including access to ocean, surf, public access to the bay and ocean shorelines, and water-based activities such as surfing, boating, fishing, and swimming are all identified as fundamental park resources in the park's 2014 GMP. A 2015 visitor use survey at the park found that viewing wildlife, natural features, and scenery were the most common activity that visitors engaged in, and that was followed by walking or hiking and swimming, surfing, and windsurfing. So that's just a really quick overview of the park's relationship to this study and some of the resources. And some of the speakers that you'll be hearing from next will expand more in terms of resources that could be impacted, in particular natural resources. Thanks very much for this opportunity to speak this evening.
Thank you so much. And we're now going to hear from Don Reapy, the guardian of Jamaica Bay. Don, join us.
Mute, start video. Here's my back where? Here's the presentation. Can you see the presentation?
No, we can see you and hear you, but we don't see the presentation yet.
All right. Let's see. Okay.
There it is.
There it is. We found it.
Here we go. Now everyone should see it.
And I can just, okay.
Yep.
Run it through there. Okay. Hi, everybody. Don Reapy here. I've been involved in Jamaica Bay issues for over 40 years and conducted many wildlife surveys over the years. I was first ranger in the National Park Gateway at the Jamaica Bay Refuge in 1974. That's how old I am. I came back in 79 and then worked for 25 years. State DEC offered me the position of a baykeeper or guardian. We chose Jamaica Bay Guardian for the American Littoral Society. So I've been doing that. And we'll move on. Uh-oh.
Don, space bar.
What's that?
Space bar, space bar. Hit the space bar.
Is just the space bar? It's not working. I'm screen sharing.
Don't worry about it. Let's see.
I'm used to Zoom sessions.
There it goes.
Here we go. Just hit the space bar now?
Just a
Okay.
mouse.
All right, just a little overview of New York Harbor and Jamaica Bay, in the middle of this huge urban city here, with most of the area has been developed. Jamaica Bay was maybe twice the size it was years ago. If you go back in the 18 or early part of or late part of 1800s, this is what it might have looked like as urbanization started moving down, filling in the marshes. So Jamaica Bay is about half the size that currently as it was. Here's 1938. You can see this is before the east and west ponds and before the airport. So, but gradually this is what it looks like more like today. Kennedy Airport filled in 4,500 acres of salt marsh, something that you couldn't do today. We have 4 landfills. 2 of them are now state parks. The Fountain and Pennsylvania Avenue landfills are now a state park. We have another state park in Bayswater. We have lots of buffer area lands around the bay that New York City Audubon and Trust for Public Land help protect. And the remaining marshes are mostly in the middle of the bay here. Here's the little Broad Channel community where I live, little enclave within the park here. And Jamaica Bay has recorded over 340 species of birds in the past 50 years. Why? It's located on the Atlantic and Hudson River flyways in a big estuary. So I've always said to people, you can see more birds and wildlife in Jamaica Bay than most of the big areas upstate, like the Adirondacks or the Catskills, because here they're all concentrated. One of the iconic species that early on gave great importance to the refuge was the return of the glossy ibis nesting in Jamaica Bay in the 1960s. And of course, people love to see the snowy owl in winter, which we have here occasionally. And occasionally rare species show up in the bay, like these white pelicans. So it's a mecca for bird watchers, people from all over, international people from England. If they have any business in New York City, I'll see that they'll come into the refuge with a suit jacket on and change and go out and do some birding. In the 1980s, I helped conduct a 2-year survey of finfish. And since then, I've recorded a number more. So I have a list of 108 species of finfish found in Jamaica Bay. This is a gray triggerfish, which is more of a southern species that showed up, including American eels. We counted 58 American eels when they coming out of the East Pond pipeline when they opened it up. So, and of course, a lot of the recreational species here. People fish in Jamaica Bay. The fact that it's been dredged and there are deep channels everywhere. So it brings a great diversity of marine life into the bay. This is a striped bass. And in recent years, many of the older naturalists myself turned to insects, which people tend to forget about, a very important part of the ecology of any system. And we've identified 70 species of butterflies and over 700 species of moths in Jamaica Bay alone. And of course, in recent years, in the last 30 years ago, you didn't see seals in the bay. Now with improved water quality, we see more harbor seals. This is 2 years ago, taken on one little haul outside in the bay in winter. Occasional gray seal. This is at Fort Tilden. And they're all here because of the resources here. And one of the major fish species we found in the bay is menhaden, which some people call the most important fish in the sea because it feeds everything else. All the seals, the whales, the dolphins, the bass. Here's what it looks like, a drawing by Joel Storr, Rockaway resident. And of course, humpback whales we're seeing right offshore here, which is unheard of, 40 years ago. And they're all here because of that menhaden. Just billions of menhaden. And one of the reasons the menhaden are here because we helped push the Omega oil fleet offshore. They were coming in to use purse seines and scoop up most of the menhaden for the Omega oil pills, the fish oil pills. But despite, all that, productivity, we have problems in the bay. And one of them is that the marshes are declining. Here's a marsh that is fragmenting. Here's one also fragmenting. This is I believe Park Service showing the extent of marsh loss since 1950, between 1951 and 2008. So most of the red area is lost since then. So it's a real tragedy to lose the most important habitat in the bay, which is the salt marshes. This is Joko Marsh, which is still pretty viable, and this is what we'd like to see down the line. Bring in the Corps of Engineers who did a great job in coming into the bay and taking the lead and helping restore a lot of these marshes. This is Ruffle Bar Marsh out here, Ruler's Bar Marsh, which we decided we'd get the community got involved, the Jamaica Bay Eco Watches and the Littoral Society, New York City Order, and other groups came and saved the government a lot of money through bringing volunteers to a lot of the planting. So we planted 2 of the big marshes in the bay. And of course, we made it an educational thing for school kids too, to come in and learn about marsh ecology. And then about 10 years ago, we got some funding. We hired kids in the summertime, you know, high school and college kids. We call them Jamaica Bay rats. And they work at summertime, 8 weeks. And they did a lot of the marsh planting out there. Some corporate groups, Mitsui, I think it's that. The end of the first year, we had 88,000 plugs of individual plugs of Spartina alterniflora in that one ruleless marsh out here. A year later, you could see we had a good growth there, and recruitment started to happen. The fiddler crabs came in, horseshoe crabs came in, a lot of the shorebirds came in. So the marshes, this is the breach after Hurricane Sandy. This is Blackwall Marsh and Rulers Marsh, the 2 marshes that we're restoring, mostly with volunteer work. Another big project in the Bay is the Living Shoreline project, which is right on the next to the West Pond. So one of the other things that Little Size involved in is marine debris, which is a big issue around the Bay. So you can see before and after one of the shorelines of the Bay, and again, using volunteers and our restoration corps, kids that we hired in the summer. And of course, with my boat, the Guardian boat, this is a Student Conservation Association leaders that we got 1 year, great kids. They did great work. We've taken tons and tons of debris off the shorelines. So it's a project that's been going on since 1986. And we've got help from some major groups like the Church of God, who take big items. They even take boats out of the marsh. And they're a great group to work with. They worked in all weather. And when I was with the Park Service in the last couple of years, we started along with the Eco Watches, the Operation Clean Sweep, trying to remove all the derelict boats, you know, around the bay, especially those who were on the marshes, impeding marsh growth. So this is one big success story. This is Schmitz Marina, what it looked like. It was a totally trashed area. Took 20 years to get that guy off that land, and a $13 million project. Took out the contaminated fill, brought in clean fill, put in some nice wetlands there, and we were involved in planting that as well. So over the years, we've how many plugs of Spartina? I'm asking Alexandra.
500,000 or 465.
465,000 individual plugs of Spartina and other wetland plants. This is what that Sunset Cove, which is at the south end of Broad Channel, looks like today. So we had a lot of success over the years. One of my favorite projects, of course, I've worked with wildlife again for the 40 years, was restoring barn owls, some of the raptor populations that were declining. So we put these barn owl boxes out in remote areas around. And there's Chris Nadareski with New York City DEP helping there, and some volunteers erecting a big barn owl box. Dennis Guiney, my carpenter, building all our barn owl boxes and bird boxes. And of course, one of the culprits, we try to keep out the raccoons. That's why we have this predator guard right here. And one of the most beautiful birds you'll ever see, but strictly nocturnal and hard to find. Young ones, we check the boxes every year. We banned all the young birds. And we put a couple of boxes that were easy for the public to view. This is at Big John's Pond, which was a box that was used for many years. And here's 5 progeny for 1 year that were all banded. Of course, the next bird that was in serious decline, along with bald eagles and peregrines and so on, the top of the line raptors, the osprey. There were no ospreys nesting in Jamaica Bay or New York City until 1990. We had the first pair. You can see this one has a menhaden in its talons, so the importance. We now have 35 nesting pair. Ospreys are fully restored. These are 2 juveniles. And it's for fierce-looking birds, they're pretty docile. Remember, they eat only fish. But you don't want to get caught by those talons. A species of concern, a special concern with the especially with anything to do with sea level rise and loss of upland habitat, is the horseshoe crab. Horseshoe crabs lay billions of eggs around the bay, and that provides the food source for one endangered bird, the red knot, which you see in the foreground, and many of the other shorebirds that are migrating through Jamaica Bay in springtime. But we also have a horseshoe crab festival, and we invite the public down. So it's a great educational resource. Another species of concern is the diamondback terrapin, heavily impacted by an overabundance of raccoons in the bay, dig up all the eggs, but also any loss of upland habitat will negatively impact these birds. There's Alexander Kanonik, who is the new executive director of the Northeast chapter, or the chapter director. I'm sorry, Tim Dillingham is our executive director over Sandy Hook. So she's taken over the reins this year. And she's also a terrapin expert. I worked with the Port Authority for many years trying to come up with plans to make the airport less attractive to birds. So I'm a member, the longest term member of the Wildlife Hazard Task Force at the Port Authority. And, you know, birds and planes don't mix too well. One of the other concerns we have is along the beachfront, you know, all the ground nesting birds like the skimmers, beautiful black skimmers nesting at Breezy Point, common terns, and of course the federally threatened piping plover. I wrote the original management plan for that threatened plover in 1979 for Gateway. And, you know, people and birds do seem to get along, you know, given the little barriers and given a chance. They can coexist. We have an amazing diversity of wildlife, as I said, in Jamaica Bay, and that's why we're concerned. A lot of them nest in the bay. There's some of the great egrets that are nesting in the bay with cormorants. And of course, my favorite egret is Edgar, who's been visiting my home for many years, walks in the house. so here's Edgar after a rainstorm. But I told him early on, there's no such thing as a free lunch. I want some good photographs. So this bird just left again. It was down south somewhere. I'll be back in the springtime. But again, Jamaica Bay is, aside from wildlife habitat, it's an amazing recreational resource for the 3 million people that are living around the bay, whether bird watching or kayaking. And I'm going to end it right there. Thank you very much. That was an hour program that was done in 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Don. We're now going to hear from Professor Bernice Rosenzweig, who will be speaking to us about some of the environmental impacts on Jamaica Bay.
Hi, okay, so can you all hear and see me okay? I can
yes,
assume.
I can hear you and see you.
I'm actually going to primarily just talk a little bit about sea level rise and storm surge and resilience. I only have a few slides. I just hope to kind of start a discussion about these topics. And so following that, I think it's really always helpful when you're thinking about resilience to always ask resilience of what to what. You know, that was a concept that was introduced by Stephen Carpenter, 20 years ago. It's still very useful when discussing these types of projects and initiatives. So on the issue of resilience of what, that means different things to different people. Jamaica Bay is, a home to many of us, including my family. It's an important refuge for wildlife, like we've heard so much about. And it's a place where both of those exist together, where people are not cut off from the natural resources of the bay and where people have access to the bay. In terms of resilience to what, these storm surge barriers are designed to provide resilience to storm surge events, as we all know. And Jamaica Bay has quite few major storm surges in recent memory. I mean, the most well-known is Sandy, which happened in 2012, where there were two major flooding events, both with the morning high tide, where the water rose to 9.3 feet above mean low slow water, and with the evening high tide, where it was much higher with the record 13.8 feet. In December 1992, there was also a major flood event, and Hurricane Irene, there was also a major flood event in 2011. But we also have to think about sea level rise. And many of us know that Jamaica Bay communities already experience sunny day flooding during astronomic high tides as a result of the sea level rise that has already occurred. And this is only going to increase in frequency, severity, and extent due to climate change in the absence of mitigation efforts. So for my research, I'm really interested in how we can quantify this concept of resilience. And I think one of the most useful tools that we have, pieces of data that we have, are actually these flood stages that have been developed by the National Weather Service. And they've been developed for tide gauge locations in many parts of the country, including in Jamaica Bay, like at the Inwood Tide Gauge, which is located within Jamaica Bay. And they're based on actual observations of impacts of various water levels. So there's a minor flood stage, which occurs at 7.5 feet above the mean lowest low water datum of that particular tide stage site. There's a moderate flood stage, which occurs at 8.2 feet above mean lowest low water, and the major flood stage occurs at 9.0 feet above mean lowest low water. And so the tidal range within the bay, it's 5.9 feet at this particular location. So, and I think it's useful to think about these thresholds, these datums, relative to not the lowest low water, but the mean high tide that we would experience over a long period. So if you're going to take the higher of the high tides that occur every day and average those higher high tides over the 19-year tidal epoch, this would be that mean value. It's really, the highest tide that you'd experience day to day. And so Jamaica Bay's vulnerability to sea level rise and any change in sea level, is really very well represented by looking at these tidal datums. So the difference between the mean higher high water value and the minor flood level, so when nuisance flooding starts to occur in the most vulnerable communities, is only 1.6 feet above mean highest water. That's it. That's about how much we have to work with. With 2.3 feet above mean highest tide water, then moderate flooding will occur. And that's where you have flooding occurring widespread over many of Jamaica Bay's low-lying communities. And so there have been many sea level rise projections that are available. I'm showing projections that were recently released by NOAA and many other government agencies working collaboratively. And these provide regional sea level rise projections for the continental United States. I'm showing the projections for the Battery in New York City. They give you definitely a feel for projections for Jamaica Bay. These are well within the 25th to 75th percentile projections of the New York City Panel on Climate Change, but they're useful because they also have been associated with some probabilities associated with various scenarios of global warming. So I'm going to show you the low, intermediate, and the intermediate scenarios that were part of this project. These don't include some more extreme scenarios involving very rapid ice melt. All of those are still considered possible. They're considered much less likely to happen within the 21st century, although they may be possible after 2100, where you'd see much higher sea level rise projections. So this, thinking about this 1.8 feet of sea level rise, depending on which scenario that you're considering, under the lowest scenario that may be possible mid-century, it's possible that we would get to the end of the century and then reach that 1.8 foot threshold. Under the low intermediate scenario, that threshold would be reached, although there's uncertainty, by the 2070s, and under the intermediate scenario by the 2060s. And so there's a lot of uncertainty associated with any set of sea level rise projections. Some of that uncertainty is based on uncertainties with our understanding of how the Earth system will respond to global warming. But some of that uncertainty is also associated with emission scenarios, how much heat trapping gases we're going to emit in the near term. And so we can't link any sea level rise projection with any actual projection of how much the global warm. But we can develop exceedance probabilities, so how likely it is that we will exceed some projection of sea level rise. And so, with a scenario where the planetary warming is limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, there's a 92% chance that that lowest scenario, so the scenario here, would be exceeded. The probability For the medium scenario would be 37% that it would be exceeded, and it's still very unlikely that the intermediate scenario would be exceeded. With a 2 degrees Celsius warming by the end of the 21st century, then the low intermediate scenario becomes much more likely. And it's possible that with the 50% probability that this 1.8 foot threshold would be exceeded by the 2070s. Under the highest scenarios that are considered, so 5 degrees Celsius of end century warming, so that's really high emissions plus feedbacks. Then even these more extreme scenarios become more likely with the 23% probability that this scenario would be exceeded in the 21st century. So going back to thinking about storm surge barriers and sea level rise in Jamaica Bay's resilience, the graphic that I'm showing you here is the most recent tide gauge observations from this inwood tide gauge. And it shows that we actually exceeded the minor flood stage today with the very minor coastal storm that we had today. But with 1.8 feet of sea level rise on top of a very minor event that is barely noticeable today, that would put water levels at 9.3 feet above mean lowest low water, so above the threshold for major flooding. And so from perspective, that's exactly the water levels that were reached, not during Superstorm Sandy's highest high tide, but during the morning lower of the high tide that still caused widespread major flooding throughout Jamaica Bay communities. And so on the topic of storm surge barriers, the impacts of storm surge barriers really depend a lot on their design. So how much they obstruct tidal flow day to day, and that will really vary with design. So for example, the Micelent barrier is minimal impacts ecologically because the topography allows for it to be designed so that the barrier itself doesn't really sit in the water unless it's closed. When thinking about Jamaica Bay and the potential impacts of a storm surge barrier, there's a long history of studies that have considered various types of storm surge barriers and scenarios of closing these barriers going back as far as the 1960s. And obviously we don't have time to review all of those studies, but in short, what's known from these studies and what's known from studies of storm surge barriers and many other ecosystems is that the ecological impacts are dependent both on how obstructive the barriers are to tidal flow day to day, but most importantly, how frequently they are closed for storm tides. In Jamaica Bay, that would be particularly important to consider because Jamaica Bay is so uniquely urbanized. Most of our freshwater streams have been completely buried into sewers, and most of our freshwater supply comes from these point sources, wastewater treatment plants. And those contribute nutrients, which contribute to the eutrophication of the bay. Jamaica Bay is hydroeutrophic, and could really put the bay at risk for hypoxic events and fish kills when tidal flow is reduced during these barrier closures. So in short, thinking about resilience to stormwater and sea level rise and the potential role of storm surge barriers, it really is important to think about what we're thinking about resilience to, which of these hazards. Storm surge barriers may function very well and may have minimal impacts if they're only closed very infrequently, during the types of coastal storm events that we've had so far. But with sea level rise, as high storm tides become much, much more frequently, and when we have moderate to even major flooding during minor nuisance, what would otherwise be nuisance coastal flood events, that's going to seriously impact the potential ecological effects of these types of barriers. So I hope this type of discussion was really interesting, and I look forward to hearing the other presentations.
Thank you so much. That was great. And we're now going to hear from our last panelist, Professor Zarnock, who will be speaking with us as well about some of the environmental impacts and on the ecology of Jamaica Bay.
Okay, yeah, thanks for having me. Chester Zarnock, professor at Baruch College and the Graduate Center. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that we do in Jamaica Bay and then share some of my own thoughts on the potential impacts of surge barriers. And hopefully that'll lead to some more discussion. So our work in Jamaica Bay looks at how habitat restoration influences ecosystem processes, or the ecosystem effects of coastal habitat restoration. So we've done work on salt marsh restoration projects and oyster reef projects, and thinking about other forms of restoration around the Bay. And we're particularly interested in understanding how those projects can enhance ecosystem services or benefits to the users of the Bay, both the living organisms and the people that are using the Bay for fishing and recreating and other purposes. And our work is largely focused on the issue of nitrogen removal. We've heard a little bit about how high nitrogen loads can be impacted, can impact ecosystems. And so thinking about how restoring habitat can improve nitrogen removal is something that we're very much interested in. And then we're also interested in trying to understand how restoring particularly salt marsh habitat can increase carbon sequestration in these areas. And then the other focus of our work in our lab is looking at nature-based solutions for shoreline protection and water quality benefits. And we're really interested in trying to get at understanding how we can design these things to harness ecological processes and enhance ecological processes for the greatest benefit. So to give you just a brief example of the kind of work that we do, we've been able to spend quite a bit of time studying the restored marsh islands in Jamaica Bay. And so you've seen slides on these islands already. And so the Army Corps engineer and their partners did some great work building several different marsh islands, so reconstructing several different marsh islands in the Bay. And we're interested in understanding how those newly constructed marshes are functioning. And previous work tells us that it can take years to decades for some of the functions to reach the equivalent of a natural marsh. And so, of course, we want to be able to document whether or not these constructed marshes in Jamaica Bay are performing these functions, and if not, how long will it take for them to perform these functions? And then what can we do differently within our restoration practices to enhance these processes? So one of the things that we've worked on is measuring nitrogen removal in these salt marshes. And so what we're looking at here is a plot of nitrogen removal with marshes that were restored at different times. And so looking at the screen from left to right, the green bars are youngest to oldest restored marsh sites. And then the bars on the right-hand side are natural marshes, both a healthy and a degraded marsh. And you can see that as constructed marshes age, they increase their ability to remove nitrogen. You get more nitrogen removal. But the constructed marshes have less nitrogen removal than the natural marshes. And so to me, that tells us it's really important for us to conserve and protect our natural marshes because of this important service that they provide. But the good news about the constructed marshes is that they are removing quite a bit of nitrogen. And if we compare how much nitrogen they're removing to other marshes outside of the New York area, let's say the New England area, even young marshes are removing equivalent amounts of nitrogen. So they are providing a very important service, even at a relatively young age. And hopefully as they progress and develop, they will continue to move towards nitrogen removal rates similar to natural marshes in Jamaica Bay. And then one of the things that our work on the marshes sort of led us to is thinking about the important species interactions that occur in marshes and how these species interactions develop as a constructed marsh matures. And so we know that there's a really important interaction that occurs between the salt marsh grass, Spartina alterniflora, and rib mussels, which are filtrating bivalves that live in association with the marsh. And it is a mutualism where there's an interaction where both parties are benefiting. And one of the things that's interesting is that when we do marsh restoration, we don't include the mussels in these marsh restoration projects. We put out these salt marsh plugs, and we hope the mussels will recruit, and they do in time. But one of the questions we asked is whether or not adding mussels to a newly constructed marsh could help increase its resilience and add the benefits of nitrogen removal. And so we went out and conducted experiments in these newly constructed marshes where we added mussels. And again, what we're looking at here is nitrogen removal on the y-axis, and as compared to controls and just mussel shells, not live mussels. But when we have live mussels in these plots, as shown in the picture here, we get twice as much nitrogen removal. And so this species interaction is really important in providing this ecosystem service and making the marsh more resilient. So these kinds of ecological processes that are occurring in the natural system are, and particularly in marshes where we spend a lot of our time working, are very much impacted by tidal flooding. The success of marshes and the loss of marshes are tied into how much they're inundated. And so the marshes need to be able to grow vertically by accumulating sediment and organic matter in order to keep up with sea level rise. And so you have this instance where the marshes need to be able to grow vertically to keep up with sea level rise. And then we have this potentially a new scenario where we are incorporating storm surge barriers that have the potential to influence tidal flow. So we want to start thinking about this tidal flow and how it influences marshes, as well as other organisms and other processes in Jamaica Bay. And so Bernice talked about the importance of the design of the barriers and how that influences tidal flow. There's some great work that's been done recently. Phil Orton from Stevens Institute, Hudson River Foundation, and the National West Wind Reserve up at the Hudson River site. They've put out a couple of reports that do a really nice job in looking at some of the potential impacts of surge barriers. So maybe we can get that in the chat to share. But a really important take home is that the ecological impacts are going to scale with the reduction in tidal flow. So the more that Rockaway Inlet is blocked up by these surge barriers, the greater the potential for ecological impacts. And I'd like to point out that the ecological impacts can be positive and they can be negative. And so when we have environmental change, you can have winners and losers. But the key thing is that the tidal flow is probably going to be one of the biggest drivers to determine the winners and losers of this kind of environmental change, because the tidal flow is driving all of the fundamental variables, physical and biological variables that are responsible for making the system work. So this is a terribly important leverage point in the functioning of the system. So just a couple of my thoughts on questions that we need to be pursuing and thinking about when we explore the use of a surge barrier in Jamaica Bay. We have to keep in mind that the salt marshes need to accumulate sediment in order to keep up with sea level rise and to remain healthy and functioning. And we know that sediment is imported into Jamaica Bay through Rockaway Inlet. So we really need to understand how that sediment is going to be impacted and by the storm surge barrier, and how that potentially can impact salt marshes. We know that tidal flow, particularly during spring tides, it can be an important source of sediment to the marshes, and we also know that during storm events, significant amounts of sediment can be dumped onto salt marshes, and of course, the purpose of this surge barrier is to reduce potential flood. So we need to be able to think about that, and in the case of marshes, if we have say a reduction in the tidal prism or a reduction in tidal range, we're going to see shifts in the organisms that live in marshes, right? So there's a very interesting pattern of zonation of the plants and organisms that live in the intertidal zone in a marsh. And if the tidal range decreases, we can expect a shift in those zones downward. And so that could influence plants in different ways. It can influence organisms that live there in different ways. And so we need to understand that. And then a reduction in tidal flow in Jamaica Bay from a storm surge barrier could also result in some positive impacts. So for example, rib mussel recruitment could be enhanced because less larvae will get ejected out of the bay. And so that might end up being a positive from these storm surge barriers. Thinking about water quality, I think is another important area. Very small changes in tidal flow and salinity can have large impacts on dissolved oxygen levels and stratification in the bay. And so we really need to have research that helps us understand that. We could have enhanced residence time, or how long the water stays in the bay, and that could influence oxygen. It could result in a positive impact in enhancing microbial mediated nitrogen removal, which it can be a benefit. And then we also have to think about how these processes can be coupled to climate change, and we have warming on top of changes in tidal flow. Thinking of projecting into the future, how is that going to affect water quality? And I think we should also acknowledge the fact that we've made great strides in improving water quality in Jamaica Bay over the last several decades, due in large part to the significant investment that the New York City Department of Environmental Protection has put into infrastructure, wastewater infrastructure around the bay. And so water quality has become significantly improved, and we don't want to see those gains be lost through an infrastructure change and that reduces tidal flow. So we need to have sort of a broader approach in thinking about what mitigation might look like. Mitigation might be in water mitigation, but it could also be upland mitigation as well to help New York City DEP deal with their water quality issues. And so where do we go? Well, I think the key is to begin monitoring. Long-term pre and post-construction monitoring is critical for a project like this. When we look at other storm surge barriers, one of the biggest limitations to understanding the ecological impacts is the fact that we don't have pre-construction data or limited pre-construction data. And so we really need to be able to leverage existing sets of data, like water quality data that we're already collecting in and around New York City, but also add on the data that we need to understand, fish migrations, how birds are going to be impacted, invertebrates, etc. So this is something that we really need to get started on now, so that we have multiple years of pre-construction monitoring, so that informs what the ecological impacts are post-construction. And so I'll end there, and I think pass it back to Nathan.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. We are now going to begin a discussion amongst the panelists. I know we're running a little close to the end of when we said this event would be at 8 p.m. So hopefully the panelists can stick around a little longer than 8 p.m. And hopefully our audience can also stay with us, because I think we have a great opportunity to hear kind of a dialogue amongst all of these various stakeholders. So if the panelists could start up their video and unmute themselves, we'll jump right into a conversation. Welcome back, everyone. I know some of the panelists have limitations on what they can say or respond to in terms of questions. So I'll address different questions to different panelists, but I just want to jump right into it, actually, because I'm curious to hear this from all the panelists, but specifically from Dawn. You're the guardian of Jamaica Bay. You live on the bay. You've been flooded by the bay many times. You're intimately involved in the health of the bay. What do you make of this plan? What do you think of the Army Corps' proposal?
What do I make of the plan? God, it's really and it'll be engineering marvel if this thing ever is completed. I really don't know what the impacts are going to be. I have no idea. I'll leave that up to the scientists. But I would also say that I would confer with all the naturalists around the city, people that are intimately involved with wildlife, and a lot of these people have, a lot of experience and may come up with some good answers. But all I know is in Broad Channel here, all our calendars have the high tides on it. So every day when I get up in the morning, I look at the calendar, what day it is, what the tide is, what the wind is. If it's northeast wind with a full moon, a new moon, I better move my car. But the only thing I would say other than that is I would like to see a more of an effort into restoring and increasing the marshes in the bay. Aside from being great wildlife habitat for marine life and birds and so on, they protect the mainland here, by extending marshes. So while we're still thinking about putting all these barriers in there, we should also spend a lot of money and time and effort into improving and increasing the marshes in the bay. That will help a lot as well.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Do any of the other panelists want to offer up kind of their take on the plan, what their opinions are? I know that Patty is not able to, but Chester or Bernice, do you want to offer up kind of, do you think this plan is, this tentatively selected plan is the best solution for sea level rise, specifically for storm surges, specifically in Jamaica Bay?
I'm not offering up a recommendation, but I think it's really important that we make this distinction between sea level rise and storm surge, because these barriers are designed to manage storm surge, which are generally infrequently occurring events. But sea level rise is going to cause what would now happen infrequently and be associated only with a severe coastal storm to happen very regularly, so that we would get the same water levels, even with a minor storm like today, happening, just because of sea level rise and the combination of those smaller events. And barriers impacts, on dissolved oxygen in the bay and the potential formation of hypoxic zones are really dependent on how long they're closed and how frequently they're closed. So, if we're thinking about using these barriers to really address sea level rise, so that they'd be closed very, very frequently. I don't know if that's mechanically possible in terms of their operation, if they're designed to be closed so frequently, but based on all of the research that's available, that's been conducted in Jamaica Bay and that's been conducted on storm surge barriers more broadly, that the ecological impacts would be really severe. So it really comes down to how the barriers are used, not whether there's a barrier or not a barrier, but how they're used, and whether the idea is that they're going to be used to address only infrequent storm surges, or whether they're going to be used to address the equivalent high waters that we're going to get very frequently as a result of sea level rise.
Definitely a great point. Chester, did you have anything you wanted to add about kind of your take on the plan?
Yeah, I think it's a challenging question. It's a loaded question because it really needs to be explored through many different lenses. Thinking purely about the ecology of the bay versus thinking about the social components, and I think that's what the Army Corps of Engineers is doing. And so I think that in the incorporation of their cost benefit analysis and all that, I think it helps capture that broader perspective, which is what we need. But I think the point that Bernice just made as well regarding sea level rise for storm surge is something that we need to continue the conversation on.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that is a question I have as well. It's a $52 billion plan to address storm surges, but on Jamaica Bay and in other parts of the city, it would not actually address sea level rise. And so these communities around Jamaica Bay would still be at risk from the already severe problems of flooding and erosion. And I guess my question then for the Army Corps and for the panelists is, why not? Why can't this plan be designed to address sea level rise as well. I know that's not the mandate of the plan, but if you're only going to address storm surges and ignore sea level rise, is this really an effective use of $52 billion?
I'll comment a little bit. From a national perspective, the coastal storm risk management programs are framed around storm surge. They are designated by Congress to respond to threats from storm surge, not the enabling legislation is not explicitly about sea level rise. That storm surge is in light of sea level change. And we do include sea level change in the analysis as it affects annual exceedance probability events, or what you would say are large scale events, large magnitude events. So in one way, sea level rise is baked into the cake of storm surge, and then another in terms of tidal flooding and sunny day flooding. Those are quite different problems, as the panel is alluding to.
Carissa, did you want to comment on that or no?
I guess I would just add that, while we really haven't solved that or answered that question fully at this point, we do have those residual risk features there, and we do look to make this plan an adaptable plan so that we can address those more frequent events going forward into the future. That there may be an engineering solution to the need to close the gates more frequently. That we need to, we just need to look at that question a little more.
Do any of the other panelists have any thoughts on that idea of, we'll have a storm surge gate, but we won't be addressing sea level rise on Jamaica Bay? Any thoughts on that? Yeah. I mean, I guess a question for me that's sort of...
I'm sorry, Nathan. I just have a question for Kyle, something that he said, and I don't know if I understood it. And so are we talking that the legislation that, so the money came through legislation, that legislation specified storm surge barriers and did not specify accounting for sea level rise. And may I ask a question so that came from Congress, and we know that climate change doesn't exist in Congress or in many sections of Congress. I'm being facetious, of course, but I'm wondering if part of the reason why that wasn't addressed was it political? That is, that it was easier and maybe even only possible to get such funding if you were addressing storm surges, and not that you had to account for sea level rise resulting from climate change, which we know doesn't exist. Never happened.
Just to clarify and respond to this, the enabling legislation I'm talking about is not HAT specific. It's for all the coastal storm risk management programs in the Corps.
Okay.
So this is not about New York City's enabling legislation. It's about how the programs are designed as a whole. And the spirit of that is that the federal government is working on large magnitude events, and local projects augment that through zoning, through hazard mitigation programs, through other programs that work together to buy down risk for communities. So that's the spirit of high magnitude focus events and the focus on storm surge.
That clarifies that for me, because I was wondering if it, if that was political. Okay, thanks.
I had a question to follow up with Patty about, actually, which was, in your presentation, you mentioned a little of the impacts that might happen in within the National Park Service's land. And, of course, the National Park Service is one of the largest stakeholders on the Bay. As you said, it's got so much area around the Bay that could be impacted by this. I think you'd mentioned that for instance, the dunes and beaches around the end of the Rockaways could become static engineered features. Are you able to talk about a little bit more about any of those other potential impacts to places that the National Park Service manages? I mean, I know there's the very tip of the Rockaways, but it would also go through Floyd Bennett Field, and there could be impacts on other areas in Jamaica Bay.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. And I think, and of course, we'll be detailing more detailed comments in our comments that will come forward. I think I want to preface by saying, as both Chris and Kyle said, the Tier 1 DEIS is conceptual. And so that makes it really difficult to really drill down and understand what the impacts will be, because we're dealing with a conceptual issue. And so one of the things we've tried to focus on is identifying resources that might be at risk, and also kinds of information, and both Chester and Bernice, I think, identified some of those information gaps and things that really need to come forward in the future analysis. But the conceptual plan identifies that there would be 120 up to about 125 acres of Park Service land that would undergo construction, on which in the Jamaica Bay area, in which there would actually be construction on that 125 acres to support this. So the storm surge barrier itself connects Floyd Bennett Field over across to our property on Beach Channel Drive. When we think about the historic resources, you can consider that some of these structures might have protective features for those historic resources, but there's also the setting, the feeling, the aesthetics of those historic districts. In most cases, is very dependent upon a connection to the water. They're situated where they are, and their historic significance comes from that relationship. So thinking about things like that, both Don and Chester touched on the marsh in Jamaica Bay. We've been partnering, the Army Corps has been a huge partner with the Park Service and many other organizations in terms of, for the last couple of decades, of doing marsh restoration in Jamaica Bay, and making sure that we're going to continue to have an ecosystem that will support marshes within Jamaica Bay, and the sediment transport that's necessary to sustain those marshes. Thinking about the hydrology and hydrologic changes, and what are going to be the temporal and spatial changes in things like salinity, dissolved oxygen, and temperature, and how that could impact and affect. So yeah, we considered a broad range of potential impacts. But again, at this phase, it's hard to really identify specific impacts because the project's not at that level of analysis. But I think at this phase, from our agency perspective, it's important that we feel it's important to identify resources we think could be impacted, and the kinds of information and analysis that we think is really critical to be able to understand that. Because ultimately, if there would be construction of any part of the project on NPS property, we would need to have that mutually acceptable plan. And ideally, the analysis and compliance and consultations that the Corps would do would be determined to be adequate and sufficient for NPS adoption.
Thank you. That was really helpful. Yeah, I mean, I also agree. It would be fantastic to see a little clearer explanation as the plan moves forward about what this could even look like. I can't really visualize what this would mean for Floyd Bennett Field. Is there going to be like an 18-foot wall running through the middle of Floyd Bennett Field and then looping all the way around the tip of the Rockaways? Or is it going to be kind of completely cutting off, Breezy Point from the waterfront? It's not clear to me. Perhaps the Army Corps can speak to that. Like when might there be more clear renderings of what some of these proposals could mean?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to that a bit. I would say that we fully acknowledge that there's a lot of data we would like to gather, a lot of information about and details about the plan that we want to have before we can really speak definitively about impacts. And I think that's why this tiered EIS process is going to be so critical, is that we're moving through this initial feasibility phase, and then getting to a higher level of design where we can provide our resource agencies with enough information that they can make a decision. And that's what, it's hard to wrap your head around the tiering process a little bit because it's so huge and vast, but and it is challenging on many levels. But I think the important thing that's helpful for us in the environmental branch on this team is that at the tier, this is not the only bite of the apple. At the tier 2, we will make decisions at the tier 2 level with additional information, with that sort of that level of detail that's needed about that will help us really identify the impacts and know the scale of the impacts and hopefully adjust our plan accordingly as we go forward. So that's the best answer I've been able to give on that. And I think it is challenging, but we appreciate our cooperating agencies, Patty and everyone that's been working with us, and that's why we're here tonight to really. We're so grateful to be here to hear from all of you and start to identify those data gaps and really work on those, and kind of plan for the future, because it's just amazing the time that you need to set up, the studies that we may need to answer those questions or the strategies that we may need to take to answer those questions together. So that is sort of all, it does take some time, but we really are sort of at the beginning. And I think that it's just important to remember that the tier 2 is where, we would look closer at those details. So that's over. That's all I got on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I wonder, Nathan, if we could just take 2 questions from the Q&A from the audience. To the audience, we apologize that there was not enough time for more questions from the audience, but we do thank our panelists for even staying a little bit. And if we could just take 2 questions from the audience, and if our panelists would not mind staying for 2 questions. And Nathan, I'll let you pick which questions are in the Q&A. And thank you for that. 2 questions, that's all.
I do see several people asking questions about, taking a greener approach to this problem, and also considering managed retreat. And I guess that's a question for the panelists as well, for all the panelists. Can we take a different approach to solving this issue of storm surge and sea level rise by looking at greener solutions than building walls or building storm surge gates, and also thinking about managed retreat, where we move away from the water and open up space for the marshland to move into these areas that might not really be tenable in the future? How does the panel respond to that question? What do you envision some other greener solutions, or do you think managed retreat is a good solution specifically for the Jamaica Bay region?
I'll just start by saying I think that the DEIS hasn't really provided a lot of information in terms of the non-structural alternatives or the use of NNBFs in terms of part of the plan. And so I know that's one area that we're looking forward to seeing more detailed information coming forward. And I think some of that is even identified as coming forward potentially in the final EIS, I think it's said.
Don, I know that that's something
yes,
that's something you. Sorry, not to interrupt. Go ahead, Carissa.
So, make me an offer.
Brett, I think, had something, and Don.
Make me an offer.
Yeah, Don, I was going to say you've spoken openly about the idea that managed retreat might be necessary on Jamaica Bay.
Yeah, I don't know if politically it's feasible. People don't want to leave, and nothing's going to happen until we have another major Sandy event, and then people finally wake up. But too many people.
And Brett, you had a question or statement.
Well, yeah, I was just going to comment that, I think that if managed retreat is not part of the solution package that we adopt, then I think it really is going to be the end of a lot of the natural ecosystems of Jamaica Bay, right? Because as sea level rises, if there's nowhere for the marshes to migrate, and I saw Catherine made a comment about that in the chat as well, there's going to come a time when we'll essentially just be walling ourselves in, right? Walling the city in at the expense of the remaining bits of ecosystem. You know, that's a few generations of homeowners down the road. So, you know, it might not seem like a reality for a lot of people, but if you think 50, 60 years down the road, with some of the sea level rise projections, I think that's just a reality. And that's a value judgment that has to collectively be made. You know, do we keep the homes at the expense of the ecosystem, or is there some kind of balance that we can find? I don't know, but you know, I think that's a hard choice that people need to make.
Okay, and the last question, Nathan, what's there for us?
I'm looking here to see if there's a great summarizing question. Certainly, if you see one that you want to elevate, let me know. But I mean, for me, like, I feel like a question that people are touching on and that I think would be great for the panelists is just about this idea of impacts. You know, this particular proposal is going to have the most impact on Jamaica Bay. Looking through the draft report here, it's going to impact, you know, the fish habitats, the wetlands, the floodplains, the marine habitat, the protected species, bald eagles. You know, is looking through the plan, and Jamaica Bay, within this citywide plan, Jamaica Bay is going to be having the most environmental impacts. So what is an acceptable level of impact if we're going to be trying to save the communities around Jamaica Bay at the expense of the environment? You know, can the panelists respond to that? Like, what is the acceptable level of impact that we are willing to take on? Could be one for on to address as well, but certainly for all of the panelists.
I think that might just be a question to leave everyone in the audience and all the panelists with, because that is the question, is it not? That there are these, you know, let it go back to nature, the ecology will take care of itself sort of thing, or no, we have to fight to protect people's residences and the like. And I feel that we've sort of, if pairing this with our conference in the spring, when we looked at the communities along Jamaica Bay, and today we're looking at the water, and not only the water, but the bay as ecosystem. And we just see the problems. And I know this is very naive, but with all that Kyle and Carissa really brought out how complicated this is, because you have to account for this, and then you have to account for that, and then, oh, but you have to put this in, and then let's not forget to talk about that. And this is just a silly, naive responses. It would have been easier to find a different fuel system instead of burning all the carbon for 100 years, because it's going to take us so much more than that. And it's a harder and more complex problem for humanity to take care of what we messed up. And I know that's naive and it's not where we are, but I just think that the extent of the complexity of the problem that all our panelists tonight have presented in what's this one small geographic area. And it's a life place for people and for animals, and all those pictures that Dawn showed us, and all the marshlands and just the living organisms, and yet they are all threatened, as are we all, by climate change. Do any of the panelists have any final words of wisdom for us, or would you like a comment or anything before we close up? I really do appreciate your participation and your willingness to stay over time. But do any of you have any closing comments?
What comes next? I mean, that's my question for the panelists. What do we do next?
Well, I think one thing, just kind of following on that, yeah, maybe it's naive to think about what happened in the last century, and there is quite a lot of sea level rise significant to Jamaica Bay that's locked in, but a lot can still be avoided by reducing emissions in the near term. And Jamaica Bay is a frontline community, so we should think about adapting to sea level rise, but we also should think about everything that we can possibly do to prevent these worst scenarios of sea level rise from happening.
Jester, you wanted to?
I was just going to say, this is a terribly complicated issue. Social components, economic components, ecological components. It's very complicated. And I think like an event like this is really important. 150 people being engaged with this question and this problem is really encouraging. I'm really excited to see that. And I think we need to grow that engagement so that people understand what could happen and what the future might bring, and how we can play a role in changing that.
I just do want to note that we had a lot of students in the audience tonight, which was great. Dawn, you had something you wanted to say?
No, I was just going to say it's probably too late for a managed retreat. There's so much hardened surface around. It's going to be a forced retreat, and people have short memories. We had Sandy and everybody's excited. We haven't had a major storm. That's why I think something's going to happen only when we have such a serious event happen that people realize we have to do something now. But I don't know.
Okay, and so my final thanks to Brett and the Science and Resilience Institute, to Kyle Graciano for New York Seagate, to Nathan, our moderator, to Bernice and Kyle and Carissa and Chester and Don and Patty. Thank you so much. By the way, I recently was at Floyd Bennett Field, and most of you probably know it, but people in the audience, get out there. It is a marvel to see and experience and go to. And with that, thank you all for attending this, our first evening breakfast talk. We're actually having a breakfast talk next Friday. For those of you just want to check that out, a completely different subject. It's going to be on the Waterfront Commission, established in 1953 to fight corruption at the docks of New York and New Jersey. And now New Jersey says, we want to pull out of this. We don't think there's a need for a waterfront commission. The docks are no longer corrupt, so they say. So, and that's before the Supreme Court this year. So we're just going to have a talk on that a week from Friday. So again, thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you again. I'm just going to close. Goodbye. Applause. I don't know. How do we do that for online? There's some way of doing it. Thank you for everybody.